Hi, welcome to Culture and Causation. I'm Aaron Briley, and my guest today is Alex Nowrasteh, and I'll be talking with him about his article, Immigration and the Welfare State, Immigrant and Native Use Rates and Benefit Levels for Means-Tested Welfare and Entitlement Programs, and also about immigration more broadly. Now, Alex is the Director of Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute and the Herbert A. Seifel Center for Trade Policy Studies. His popular publications have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and the Washington Post, and others. He is a co-author of Wretched Refuse, The Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions, and a booklet titled Open Immigration, Yay and Nay. And I'm very excited to speak with you about immigration today, Alex, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Great. Now, in your article, you show that immigrants use less government aid than native-born Americans. Can you explain the results of your research? And this refers to legal immigrants, right, as opposed to illegal ones?
It includes all immigrants.
Okay.
So illegal immigrants as well as legal immigrants. So what we did in this article was use what's called the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which is a government survey specifically designed to determine welfare use rates among people in the United States, how much they use, what programs, how often, etc. It's a very sort of intensive, detailed survey. And what we do is we're able to look in there to see what immigrants use per capita on welfare programs, and then what native-born Americans use, and just make a sort of very simple comparison. And what we found overall is that on a per capita basis, that is per person, immigrants use on average 21% fewer welfare dollars than native-born Americans do. And just to be clear about this, when I say welfare, I mean the entirety of the welfare state. I mean means-tested programs such as for poor people, Medicare, but also entitlement programs, Social
Okay.
Security and Medicare on top of that. So this doesn't include education. That's not, education is a government program that's very expensive, but it's
Right.
not part of the welfare state specifically. So we take a look at this and we find just overwhelmingly the evidence is that immigrants use less welfare programs. It differs
Mhm.
by program a little bit. So immigrants are a lot less likely to use Social Security and Medicare,
Okay.
slightly a little bit more likely to use Medicaid,
Mhm.
and then less likely to use food stamps, less likely to use TANF, which is cash aid, and less likely to use a program, and then less likely to use some of these other smaller programs. But overall, it's
Yeah.
21% less.
Do we know why that is? Are they coming with different values? I don't know. Is there a different work ethic? Or why is it that they use less?
There's a couple of theories, and it's probably a mix of all of them, frankly. So the first
Okay.
theory is that there are laws currently on the books that restrict non-citizen access to means-tested welfare benefits in the United States. So if you come in, you're not a citizen yet, you've been here for less than 5 years, even if you're legal, you don't have access to hardly any of these programs legally.
Mhm.
It's a little different in different states, some slightly different rules, but that's the general rule. So there's less access. As a result of that, the people who self-select to come to the United States are just not people who are coming here to get welfare benefits. I mean,
Okay.
even though getting welfare in the U.S. Would probably give you a better standard of living than in many, developing countries or third world countries.
Yeah.
They just don't have access to that. And as a result of that, the people who want to come here are just more likely to work. And we see this in the statistics where, immigrants, whether legal immigrants or illegal immigrants, just have a higher labor force participation rate. That means they're more likely to be employed, and if they're not employed, to be looking for a job.
I see. And just to amplify that, what you're saying here is that the immigrants who take all the pains and all the struggles to actually get to a new country, they're sort of self-selecting out for their ambition, for their work ethic, for their discipline. So by the time they get here, they're self-selected and they have these attributes in higher concentration than the norm.
That's absolutely right. I mean, in a way to think about it is that immigration is sort of like an act of entrepreneurship in and of itself, right? You're making a very costly decision in the short run with uncertain payoff in the future to try to better your situation, the situation of your family. And that's something that a lot of our ancestors did, of course, when they came to the United States. And it's something that people do today. I mean, if you're coming from, let's say, like Mexico, for instance, to the United States, you're leaving behind a Spanish speaking country, coming to a country where most people speak English. You're leaving behind a lot of the cultural norms. You're leaving behind your family, town that you grew up in, a lot of your friends, the things that you're just used to in your life that differ between countries, to take a chance in a new land. And the people who do that are usually pretty ambitious, pretty energetic, pretty cosmopolitan, and pretty interested in working hard for themselves, because that's not an easy decision for most people to make.
That's a great way of putting it. Now, you also discuss a lot of myths in your article titled "American Conservatives Should Adopt Libertarian Immigration Policy." You talk about some of these myths. You talk about myths such as immigrants are welfare queens, immigrants commit more crime, and immigrants overwhelmingly have leftist values. So maybe we could unpack a few of these. So could you maybe tell us some of the myths people have about immigration and why you don't agree with those?
Yeah, so there's basically like 14, I think, very common myths. I mean, we don't have to go through each and every one of them.
Sure.
But I think the number one that we hear a lot of is that immigrants are criminals.
Okay.
That, I mean, we hear this all the time. They're either coming here, and there have been some dramatic murders and crimes committed by individual immigrants, either legal immigrants or illegal immigrants. That's not surprising. You know, there are tens of millions of immigrants in the US. There's going to be some who are horrible people, like you would find in any large group of people, right? But when you take a look at the evidence, and you take a look at the rates at which immigrants commit crimes in the United States, are convicted of crimes in the United States, or even arrested for crimes, what we find is that legal immigrants are about 75% less likely to be criminals than native born Americans. And illegal immigrants are about half as likely. And by illegal immigrants, I mean people who broke immigration laws, most of which are not crimes, right? And when I'm talking about crimes, I'm talking about those crimes that have victims, crimes that there are state laws against. And what's fascinating is the United States federal government doesn't really keep data on illegal immigration and crime. They just do like immigration overall. So the finding forever, people have said, oh, immigrants are less likely to commit crimes. And then the response from people who are skeptical of that is, well, not illegal immigrants. And so I did some of the first research on this, and it turns out most of the criminal justice system in the US is run on the state level. And 49 states don't track illegal immigration and crime at all. But one state does. One great state of Texas tracks crimes committed by individuals by their immigration status. It's at the point of arrest and then conviction. They run identities through federal government databases to see who's an illegal immigrant. And what we find is year after year, illegal immigrants are half as likely as native born Americans to be convicted of a crime or to be arrested for a crime. And this basically holds, with some deviation, holds across all crimes. They're less likely to be convicted of homicide, of sex crimes, property crimes. There's basically a few exceptions. One of them is like gambling. I mean, who cares? Shouldn't even be a crime. And then one of them is, and there's some other like small crimes that are, you know, and some of them are serious, some of them aren't. But the general finding is they're just much less likely to be convicted of crimes than native born Americans. And legal immigrants are even less likely to. And I think this goes back to the point we made earlier, which is the people who self-select to come to the United States are those who are making a long-term investment in themselves and their family to do better. And people who think about the long term are just much less likely to be criminals.
Yeah, completely makes sense. So let's talk about, this is a great segue maybe into just your views on immigration in general. So you advocate for open immigration, and I was wondering maybe if you could discuss what that means. I know, how open can people just come over here? Is there a border anymore? So what do you mean by open immigration? Just for a lot of people, because I think when they hear that term, they just really don't know what it means. And how does that differ from what we have now?
Yeah, so I mean, I like to call it free immigration. You can call it open immigration, whatever you want. And my idea is, if you are not a violent or property criminal, if you don't have a serious communicable disease,
Mhm.
if you're not a national security threat, then you should be able to come to the United States to live and work and, maybe eventually become a citizen
Mhm.
if you want to. So in other words, the government has to have a reason to stop you,
Mhm.
and that reason has to be particular to you as an individual. It has to do with something that you've done, or you either have like a very, very high likelihood of doing. Like I'm willing to, concede a little bit to the other side on that, right? Like, let's say we don't know you're a terrorist for sure, but you spent some months in a weird training camp in Afghanistan. I'm fine with like erring on the side of being like, maybe we shouldn't let you in, right? But
Right.
in total, that's a very small number of people. And in comparison to the system we have today, it's basically like night and day. The system that I described is probably like 99% open. The system
Okay.
that we have now is probably 5 to 10% open.
Oh,
I mean, what we
interesting.
have right now is basically a centrally planned immigration system. It's the second most complicated portion of American law.
Wow.
Very few people who are allowed to come here, of the people who want to come here, are allowed to legally.
I see.
And it's just very, very different from the system of like 150 years ago, where basically there were no rules about who could come. And
Oh,
so
that's
it's really one of the most destructive anti-capitalist interventions in
yeah.
our entire law. I mean, if we think about one of the essential portions of a free market society, a free market economy,
Mhm.
is that people should be allowed to move their capital, move their
Yeah.
business, move their property to where they see fit, but also move themselves to
Yeah.
where they see fit, assuming that everyone voluntarily goes along and it's not coercive in this
Yeah.
movement, right? And immigrants moving from places that are very poor where they're unproductive to the United States where they can be more productive, where Americans want to hire them and
Mhm.
want to invite them on their property, is a very important part of a free market system. And this is something that I think we've gone way far away from in American law. And I would argue from the founding of the United States to today, a lot of things have improved, a lot of things have gone worse, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things that have gone the most worse over time and the most towards central planning over that entire time period is government control over immigration. We went essentially from open borders in the early 19th century to now basically 90 to 95% totally closed borders, and you can only come here if you fit into a few small categories of individuals
I
with
see.
certain characteristics that the government decides you have to fit into.
I see. Now, I hear some pushback from the other side. I think maybe even Milton Friedman might have said this at one point, but don't quote me there. But I'm pretty sure he did. And the idea is that, well, we shouldn't have this free immigration, as you call it, until we end the welfare state, because of this idea of immigrants coming over and then using up all of our resources. Is this a worry for you? I imagine it probably wouldn't be from what you just said earlier on in the conversation, but
Yeah,
what do
so
you make of that objection?
there's a few points about that. One is there's a second part to Milton Friedman's quote, and I don't blame you for this, but almost nobody remembers this. But the next part he said is illegal immigrants don't have access to welfare, so he's very pro illegal immigration, and we should
Interesting.
have as much of that as possible, which
Yeah.
is something that I've never heard a critic of this embrace. Like, if they were to embrace that, I'd be like, well, congrats on the consistency. But I've
Right.
never heard that embraced. Secondly, and I'm a big fan of Milton Friedman, right? I've read dozens of his academic articles, even his boring stuff about the methodology of economics,
Mhm.
right? I've read a lot of that. And I don't mean boring, like I'm an economist, but
Yeah.
it's not nearly as interesting as his other stuff. And the thing is, the empirical evidence just is not consistent with the claims that Friedman was making, either at the time or today. Immigrants tend to have an impact on US fiscal system that is either neutral or slightly positive, meaning they either pay enough in taxes to cover the costs of the benefits they consume, or they pay slightly more.
Mhm.
So it's not really that big of a deal. And thirdly, I'd say I'm opposed to the existence of the welfare state. All right. I want to eliminate the welfare state across the board. We can build higher walls around the welfare state to make sure that immigrants don't get it. We do that pretty well now, but we could and should do it better. We should get rid of it. But I don't think the existence of some bad laws that I disagree with is a good justification for supporting other laws that are very destructive and anti-capitalist and opposed to the values that we support, right? Like I also support right now getting rid of virtually, I mean, just about every gun law that you can imagine. Now, there might be a slight uptick in the number of shootings, and we do have a welfare state right now. And some of those shootings will be paid for by public taxpayers. There will just be some of that. That, in my mind, is not a good reason, though, to keep anti-gun laws in the books. All right. I also favor legalizing drugs. Some more people will probably get sick and die from taking more drugs if it's legalized, right? And some of them will use some government benefits as a result. But that is not a justification for keeping drugs illegal, I think. So we can't let some bad laws in some places on the books mean that we have to have worse laws in other places. I just don't think that makes much sense.
No, completely. And also, let's talk about, and I'm interested in your position on birthright citizenship, because this is seen by a lot of people as a convenient workaround some of our immigration laws. But I can imagine, if you already think these laws are unjust, then this wouldn't be a problem. But can you explain your position on birthright citizenship? Maybe actually talk about what it means for people who don't know, and whether or not you think it's good or bad for the country.
Yeah, so birthright citizenship is the idea that if you're born on U.S. soil and you're not the child of a diplomat or not the child of like a foreign invading army, so you're under the jurisdiction of the U.S. government. As the U.S. government has power over you, which is a fancy lawyer term for power is jurisdiction, then you are a citizen of the United States. And that has actually been the rule in common law countries going back about 800 years.
Wow.
It's called jus soli. It's in Latin, it means sort of law of the soil. And that's the old tradition. There's another way to get citizenship. It's called jus sanguinis, law of the blood, which is if your parents or one of your parents is a citizen, you're born overseas, you get citizenship, right? So for birthright citizenship has been the rule of the law of the land for, I mean, hundreds of years before the North American continent was discovered by Europeans. But it became particularly interesting when in the 14th Amendment became law after the Constitution. It enshrined birthright citizenship as part of the sort of, post-Civil War amendments to try to right some of the legal wrongs that were done under slavery, to make sure that slaves and their children born who were not citizens at the time under U.S. law would be treated as citizens, and then their kids would be treated as citizens. What's interesting is during the debate of some of those civil rights acts in the 1860s, not the 1960s, but the 1860s, where the same language was adopted into the 14th Amendment, people were like, hey, this means that people from China will be citizens. And we don't want people from China to be citizens if they're born in the United States. So that can't be right. And then people who supported the law was like, no, that actually will be what the law says. So it was sort of understood at that time. And then you fast forward a century when you have illegal immigration, because there was no illegal immigration back then. There was open borders. There was no such thing as an illegal immigrant. Now there are. And so the issue is you have the children of illegal immigrants who are born on U.S. soil are automatically U.S. citizens. And that's sort of the big controversy today. And in fact, the U.S. law is so sort of one-sided on this that if you are flying from, let's say, China to Canada and you're pregnant and you're not an American citizen and you have an emergency where you go into labor and you land in Hawaii halfway there and you give birth in Hawaii, that baby is an American citizen. That's how extreme American law is on this point. Now, I like this law a lot, and I like it because it's a safety valve. It's a pro-assimilation safety valve. It makes sure that the children of immigrants and the children of illegal immigrants born on U.S. soil will not be a legal underclass. They will have access to the same laws and the same legal rights as anybody else. And that avoids a lot of the problems that you have with second, third, sometimes fourth generation immigrants in places like Japan and in Europe, where they don't have birthright citizenship, who grow up in these countries and are alienated. They don't feel German. They don't feel French. They don't feel part of these societies. And the United States has been able to avoid that, partly at least, because of birthright citizenship. I mean, there's other features of our culture that I think push in that direction, but this legal reality of birthright citizenship just makes it a lot easier for these people and their children to assimilate into American norms and American society.
Now that's interesting. Now I also want to bring up maybe this last question here about assimilation issues. Having, large groups of immigrants coming into the country, um, and how when they come in all at once, or you have a large kind of concentration of immigrants, let's say in a particular city, then the assimilation rates are very poor because they can sort of stay within their demographic, and maybe they don't learn the language at the same rates, or they don't kind of assimilate into American culture at the same rates. Do you have any thoughts about this, or should this be a reason why we should prevent or at least filter or slow down immigration?
Yeah, so I mean, first off, it's absolutely true when immigrants congregate in an area where a large number of them, it does slightly slow down the rate at which they acquire, say, the English language. But not by the second generation. By the second generation, and the second generation are the U.S. born kids. I mean, it's basically the same
I see.
across everywhere in terms of English language acquisition. The big thing that you'll see is in a place like Southern California, and I'm from, I grew up in LA
Mhm.
and in Ventura County. What happens is a lot of Spanish speakers will typically hold on to it for like one more generation,
Oh, I
but
see.
that's it. So it's not like it's dominant, but like, for instance, the second generation, English language dominant. Third generation, according to Pew, it's 78% English only,
Oh,
and
wow.
22% can claim to also speak Spanish. But knowing what I know about like language acquisition by generations, those 22% who claim to speak Spanish probably speak with a very heavy American accent with a lot of slang, and it's probably terrible. Like my father, who is the son of immigrants from Iran, he claims to speak Farsi, but he speaks it with a Wisconsin accent like he's 5 years old. Like, he's just not a great speaker. I mean, that's generally what you see, I think, across these patterns. Um, and secondly, on all the other measures that we have, from things like, religious observation, size of family, education, income, basically between the second and third generation, that is the children of the immigrants to their
Mhm.
grandchildren, is when they become basically indistinguishable from Americans who have been here for a longer period of time. And that's just the best measure of assimilation. And part of the reason why is like the dominance of American culture globally, for both good and bad,
Mhm.
is so it's so dominant that in a way they pre-assimilate before they come here. Yeah, so what you see, right? Like we can compare it, I think, back to back in the day, right? So if you're an Irish immigrant coming here from Ireland in like 1850,
Mhm.
um, you're coming from a basically rural feudal society where they don't use clocks to tell you the time of day. You generally don't use money for exchange. A large percentage of you speak Gaelic, and
Mhm.
then you take a ship across the ocean to end up in industrial age New York, where all of a sudden you got to know the hours of the day to show up for work. You got to learn how to rent an apartment, use money on a daily basis, learn English, all this stuff from scratch. Meanwhile, today, if you're an immigrant from Guadalajara in Mexico to the United States, like, how to rent an apartment,
Mhm.
like how to use money, what the hours of the day are, and you've been watching American movies and television shows for your entire life, and you've been influenced by American slang, and you have ideas about the United States. They may not be accurate ideas, right? Like, I don't know what you can learn about the United States from watching, the Terminator movies, right? Other than some funny phrases. But
Right.
you really have an idea about how people do things, much more so than people back in the day did. And it's really like, it's shocking, it's ubiquitous. Like I was in Jordan, like 13 years ago for some work,
Mhm.
and the number of people who are young, who all of them wanted to leave and go somewhere else, just about, but they all knew things about American culture that I
Right.
thought you just wouldn't learn from overseas. Things about music,
Yeah.
about books, about newspapers,
Yeah.
like controversies, like in America. It's just like weird, but also
So it's such,
flattering, but weird.
that's such an interesting point, and I can see that too. You can see how just the influence just through entertainment and now social media. Yeah, that's a great point that I hadn't considered, but there's this pre-assimilation happening, as we speak. So that would also add to an easier transition into the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something where, people have had these fears about immigrants not assimilating to American culture since the beginning. You heard it about the Irish, about Catholics, Catholic immigrants, Italians, Jews, Eastern Europeans. You're hearing it
Mhm.
now about Hispanics, Chinese, Indians, and African immigrants. And the thing is, the assimilation rates today that we compare today to
Mhm.
immigrants from 100 years ago are basically identical. I mean, they're basically going along at the same pace as they
Okay.
were. So things are going well. I mean, America is a society that people can't help but assimilate into. And I think it's to our credit too, is that we have sort of this welcoming, immigrant friendly culture where
Mhm.
we expect you to assimilate and integrate, but we're also not rude about it. And we're going to help you along, and we're curious because our ancestors all came from different places. So that really helps out a lot. Whereas if we're talking about a place like Sweden or Denmark or Germany, it's a little different
Yeah.
because they don't have an immigrant culture, right? To be German is much more of a blood ethnic identification than the United States, where if you say you're an ethnic American, that's just like nonsense. Like, what
Yeah.
is that? Like Native American? Is that what you mean? And then people probably wouldn't even go there. Like, it
No,
just doesn't make any sense. It's not an ethnic identification.
it's not. No, absolutely. Well, this has been just a fantastic discussion. I really appreciate it, Alex. But we're going to wrap up now as we're running out of time. Is there anything else about immigration or immigration policy that we didn't cover that you think the public should know in the last, minute or two? Or
Yeah, I mean, the United States has just a very powerful history with immigration. Our values have historically been very open to people who are willing to come to this country to live and work and make a better life for themselves. And I'm flattered to hear when people want to come here. I mean, and there's a story I like to tell this to everybody, so it's not like I looked this up before coming here. But there's this great story of Ayn Rand when she was giving a lecture one time, and somebody in the audience said, "Oh, well, why do we care what you think? You're just a foreigner." And she said to the effect, "I chose to become American. What did you ever do except being born here?"
right.
And that is, I mean, such a powerful statement. Where I take a look at my grandparents and the other folks in my family, my father-in-law, and the people who chose to come here, and they really do have an appreciation for the freedom and the opportunity. I wish there was more here, right? I wish there was more capitalism. I wish there was more free, but they have an appreciation for the things here because they've seen how bad things can be in other places. And as much as we complain about policy in this country, and my job is to complain about policy in this country, right? I think it sucks.
Yeah.
But as bad as it is, they let us know and remind us of how good things really are, how bad they could really be. And they really are this sort of like lowercase c conservative ballast that I think really make us appreciate the good things about the United States, the good things about individual liberty, and the good things about capitalism that we sometimes lose sight of.
Well, I think that is a fitting note to end on. And my last question is, where can people find you and your work online?
So there's two main places. You can take a look at Cato's website, that's cato.org, and you can see our work on immigration there. And you can follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at Alex Nowrasteh. That's at AlexNowrasteh. So please give me a follow.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, Alex. It was a pleasure and very informative.
Well, thanks a bunch, Aaron. I really appreciate it.